Last week, I began a series of reflections looking at how our culture and our society has changed and is changing because of all of the new ways in which people communicate with each other, and in particular because of social media. Now, I'm basing my reflections on the various short forms that people use in internet messaging, tweeting, texting, posts on Facebook. So last week I started with LOL, which stands for laugh out loud. Now the thing with a lot of these internet shortcuts is that they can mean just about anything when people use them. And so, for example, sometimes when somebody responds to a message and says LOL, what they really mean is, oh, that was mildly amusing. Whereas some others might really mean to say, I literally laughed out loud. Well, I think it literally actually means that. But it means various different things. Now, I think, and I don't have statistics on this, but I think that LOL has probably got to be the most common response that you will find anywhere on the internet to anything that people post. People are always responding LOL. But if LOL is number one, I'm pretty sure that number two has got to be OMG. I see that one all the time. And OMG stands, of course, for oh my God. Now, what do people mean on the internet when they text or reply OMG? They usually mean something like, oh, that was mildly or somewhat surprising. Or maybe even, oh, that was really amazing. But it seems they almost never mean, by the way, God just showed up over here. In other words, when people post OMG, they don't mean it literally. And yet they post it all the time. And I'm not quite sure what I think about that. I mean, on the one hand, I do realize, I understand that often Christians, other people of faith, take a certain amount of offense at that. You know, that phrase is thrown about so casually. That there's something wrong if you have to invoke the name of God to communicate a certain level of surprise or amazement. And I get that. I mean, yes, it is used so casually that it is sucked out of all meaning. And yet, on the other hand, I can't help but think, but yeah, wouldn't it be amazing if people use that phrase OMG all the time and actually meant it? I think that's the kind of thing that can happen. I went looking through the Bible for an OMG response. You know, because there's lots of stories, lots of experiences of the Bible where people are presented with the very presence of God. And they react in all kinds of ways, of course. But there's only one response that I found in the Bible that really seemed to me like an OMG response. And it's the response of Thomas. When Jesus appeared to Thomas 1 week after the resurrection, when Thomas was faced on that day with the evidence that Jesus, this man that he had known and loved for so long, who he thought he'd lost forever, was actually alive, when the proof stood before him, Thomas had a reaction. He did not react like he said to the other disciples he would. He did not react by demanding to be able to put his fingers in the holes in Jesus' hand or his hand in Jesus' side. He reacted quite simply with a few words, my Lord and my God. That's what he said. And I can't help but think that if we had a truly modern, contemporary translation, what it would say at that point would be this: OMG, Thomas said. That's what it means. But when Thomas replied with his OMG response, what did he mean? Did he mean what someone says when they're texting or tweeting that on the internet? Did he mean, oh, this No. Thomas actually meant that something divine was happening at that moment. Of course that's what he meant. And of course Christians down through the centuries have sought to read all kinds of things into Thomas's response. They have tried to make it into a full theological statement. And so some people will open up that section in the Gospel of John and say, this is what Thomas means. I now recognize that Jesus of Nazareth is in fact the second person of the Trinity, also known as the Son, and that he is, to quote, eternally begotten of the Father, God of God, light of light, true God of true gods, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. And I don't know, but I can't help but think that Thomas in the moment didn't really think it through that much. In fact, it took about 400 years for the church to come up with a way of describing the relationship between God the Father and God the Son in those terms. Thomas didn't think all that through in the moment. But I think his train of thought at that moment went something like this. He said to himself, here I am standing before this man. This man, my friend, whom I loved and followed, my inspiration, my teacher for so many years, this man that I never expected to see again. And he said to himself that somehow at that moment, all of the ways in which he had seen this man, all of the ways, in fact, that he'd seen the universe were no longer sufficient, and he had to confess in that moment that he was in the presence of God, that God was there in the moment, that God was there in the person who stood in front of him. And that's all he was saying. That's what he was saying at that moment was not a theological statement. The theological statement would take, as I say, centuries to work out. He was simply expressing as best he could his experience of the moment, and his experience of the moment was that he was in the presence of God. That's what he was saying. And while I don't expect that we will have the exact experience that Thomas had that Sunday morning, I do believe it still happens. That people have an experience of the presence of God, and when it happens, what's wrong with acknowledging that? What's wrong with saying it? A few years ago, there was a man named Paul Vasquez. Got up one morning, came out his front door. His house, his residence is on the very borders of Yosemite National Park in the United States. And he came out his front door, and he looked up and he saw in the sky a beautiful double rainbow. And what Paul Vasquez did next has become a legend, because what he did was he grabbed his camera and immediately began filming and creating a video of that double rainbow, a video that was 3.5 minutes long. And I probably don't need to describe that video to you, because it was since posted on YouTube, and it has been seen by over 36 million people. You probably have seen it. But basically, the video goes like this. Over images of this beautiful double rainbow in the sky, all we do is we hear Paul Vasquez describing his experience of this beautiful rainbow. And it goes on and on and on. And in all that he says, Vasquez repeats one phrase over and over and over again. And guess what that phrase is? Oh my God. Oh my God. What did Vasquez mean? Was he saying what other people sometimes mean when they post those 3 letters on the internet? Was he saying this is surprising, this is unexpected, this is really amazing? Maybe. But I like to think that he was also saying that God was present for him in that moment. And why wouldn't God be present for him in that moment? When you are faced with something beautiful from creation, would that not necessarily lead you, if you're open to it, to have an experience of the Creator? And when that happens, why not acknowledge it? Why not say that, yes, this is an oh my God moment? But those moments often do happen when faced with the beauty of creation, but not exclusively. Who here hasn't had this experience? You know, you're facing a critical juncture in your life. Things are going on that you're having trouble dealing with for whatever reason. And somebody comes along, somebody comes into your life at the right moment and says those very words that you need to hear. We've all had that experience. Well, I believe that often that is an experience in which God is present. That God is in fact somehow speaking to you through that person. That God sent that person in some sense. And if that is true, why not acknowledge it? It is an OMG moment. Or who here hasn't experienced inspiration? I mean, when you're dealing with some problem, when you're trying to figure it out, and all of a sudden, you know, it makes sense in your mind, and then something kind of clicks about this problem, and everything just sort of falls into place. That's an experience of inspiration. Or sometimes when a creative idea just comes out of the blue into your mind, and it just, you know, you're able to run with it. That's an experience of inspiration. And I know that some will look at that and say, well, no, what's happening there is just so many chemical and synaptic reactions in your brain. God's not involved in that, some would say, but I don't agree. Yes, it is true that neurologists have been able to observe the various functions that take place in the brain that leads to that experience that we call inspiration. But I really believe that that's just the mechanism that God uses sometimes to get his message across to us. I mean, just because, and it is true, that things like inspiration and spiritual experience do take place, or at least begin inside the brain. And the processes can be identified. But does that mean that God's not involved? No. Because the God we believe in, the God we talk about, we say is present in the entire universe. And if God is present in the entire universe, does that not mean that God is just as present inside my brain as outside of it? And from the inside, cannot God therefore initiate that experience of God? And you know, when you live through those kinds of experiences, there's more than just chemical reactions going on there. There's more than just synapses firing. God is indeed present. Why not say so? And then, of course, there's worship. What is the meaning of all the worship that we engage in together if it does not lead, at least occasionally, to moments, however brief, when our eyes are open and the mists part, and we suddenly, unmistakably find ourselves in the presence and before the throne of the living God? Yes, I believe it is true that we should often enough walk out of an experience of worship with an OMG on our lips and mean it. So yes, I am frustrated. I am kind of annoyed sometimes at how people so casually throw around that phrase, OMG. Oh my God, this toast is cooked perfectly. Oh my God, Brittany lost weight. Oh my God, the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. And actually, I kind of think the last one might well be evidence of divine intervention. But you know what I mean? Yeah, people throw it around. But the experience of God is real. When it happens, why not acknowledge it? I think it has to do with how we look at the universe. Part of the problem is that we've not left space in our worldview, in our way of looking at the world for God to act. And I understand part of why that is. Part of it is a rejection of the way people used to see the world. You know, there was a time, like back before the 15th century, when people looked at the world and said, you know, they didn't understand what was happening. And they saw the presence of God, the presence of various deities in different things. I mean, they didn't know how disease worked. They didn't know why people got sick. They didn't know why the planets moved as they did. They didn't understand, you know, what caused earthquakes and volcanoes and crop failures. And so they easily attributed all of these things to God and various deities. And we can't go back to that. I mean, because of the way they saw the universe, they believed that they encountered divine forces on a daily basis. We can't go back to that, though, because the cost of that would be too high, because we'd have to embrace ignorance. But I think there are ways, with a modern worldview, with a scientific worldview, to still find God present, active, at work in our daily lives, all the same. For one thing, the more we discover about the universe, the more we discover how much uncertainty there is. Do you realize that when you get down to the most basic, the lowest levels of matter, down to that quantum level, you discover that you can find a quantum particle down there. And you can find out one of two things about it. You can find out where it is, or you can find out where it is going, but you cannot know both of those pieces of information at the same time. There is uncertainty. There is unknowableness there. And in all the uncertainty that's built into the universe, there is plenty of space to find God and to identify God present, active, and at work. So I really think it comes down to how you choose to see the world. Whether you're willing to make this space. When you begin to expect that experience of God, it will happen. Yesterday I went and I picked up my daughter. She'd been at Camp Ione for a week. On the way home in the car, she described to me an experience that she had while she was there. One night, they went out, they paddled over to a beach, and on that beach that night they slept out under the stars. She tells me that early that morning, she woke up, really early that morning. She woke up and sat up, and she looked out over the lake. The sun was just coming out over the tips of the trees over here. The moon was still in the sky over there. And a mist 3 feet tall had formed across the surface of the water. And as she looked at that, it was incredibly beautiful. And as she tells me, in that moment, she had her first identifiable experience in her life where she said to herself, wow, God is really present right now. OMG, if you like. You know what she did? She nudged her friend in the sleeping bag next to her. She said, quick, you gotta see this, you gotta see this. And so her friend opened her eyes, sat up, and peered out across the lake and said, wow, cool. She lay down, turned over, and fell back asleep. I guess what I'm saying is this, you've got to be in either one or the other of those sleeping bags. And it's up to you to decide which one. Just take a few moments and silently